Hello, my dear students. Welcome back to +2 Biology. From the chapter Human Reproduction, we have already completed the events, pre-fertilization events. That means the gametogenesis, male gametogenesis, spermatogenesis, the female gametogenesis, oogenesis in our previous session. And you know the female reproductive system structure in details, the male reproductive system structure in details, and also the gametogenesis process. And you have already learned the structure of sperm and ovum in detail. And our next topic in connection with the chapter Human Reproduction is menstrual cycle. So we were discussing about the female reproductive system and its details. So the structure we have completed, oogenesis we have completed, and it is more important to know about the menstrual cycle in human female. Okay, you know the menstrual cycle is shown by female primates, and the other members, other mammals show what estrous cycle. Okay. And so menstrual cycle is defined as, how can we define menstrual cycle? You know it's a monthly cycle. So anyway, it is defined as the cyclic events which takes place in a female from one menstruation to the beginning of next menstruation. So whatever events take place in a female from the beginning of one menstruation to the beginning of next menstruation is considered as menstrual cycle. Okay, it includes the changes in the hormone levels, pituitary hormone levels, ovarian hormone levels, changes in the uterus, changes in the ovary. We have to discuss these events under 4 major headings: pituitary hormone events changes, ovarian hormones changes, ovarian events, and uterine events. That means what happens to the pituitary hormones during menstrual cycle, what happens to the ovarian hormones during menstrual cycle, what happens or what are the events in the ovary, and what are the events in the uterus during menstrual cycle. Okay, before heading to that session, let me ask you, when does the menstruation begin? Tell me, when does the menstruation begin? You know, menstruation begins in puberty. Okay, the first menstruation in puberty. Okay, the first menstruation and the starting of menstruation in the puberty is known as menarche. Okay, so what is it? The first menstruation, the beginning of menstruation during puberty, the first menstruation is called menarche. Okay, and it is in the puberty. It depends on, okay. So, what is called menopause? What is meant by menopause then? That means the menstruation will be stopped in the age of 45 to 50 years. Okay, the stoppage of menstruation at 50, around 50 years, it's called menopause. So keep in mind, the beginning of menstruation is called menarche and the ending of menstruation is called menopause. And a human female or a female, any other primate female is reproductively active or fertile, during this period. That means from menarche to menopause, the female is fertile. Okay? Then, so the beginning, the end. Anyway, what happens in every menstrual cycle? We are just discussing with the help of this cyclic representation, then we will follow that graph representation. Okay? So, you know, the menstrual cycle is a cyclic event which happens in every month. Okay, I mean from 1 to 29 days is calculated as 1 to 29 days. Normal menstrual cycle is from 1 to 29 days. If so, the first days, 1 to 7 days is the periods day. The periods days. Okay. 1 to 7 days, the female shows menstruation, the menstrual bleeding. And from after menstruation, about 8 to 13 days, the female shows active proliferation of the endometrium. That means during menstruation, she is releasing off the endometrium lining of the uterus. The inner lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. You have studied, and it is rich in blood vessels, you know, and during menstruation, a female is shedding off this endometrium lining. The broken endometrium along with the blood is released out as menstrual bleeding. So after the menstruation, in a female, within the uterus, there will be active proliferation of what? The endometrium. Okay, so the proliferation of endometrium takes place about 8 to 13 days. Okay, by that time there will be, within the ovary there will be what? The maturation of ovarian follicles. We will discuss with the help of graph. Then after the maturation of the follicle, about 14th day, there will be the release of ovum. So it's known as ovulation. Normally during the 14th day the ovulation takes place, even though it's considered as 12 to 17 days period. Then after this release of ovum, the remainings of the follicle is developing to, the remainings of the ruptured follicle is developing to corpus luteum. Then is a period of luteal activity. Developing corpus luteum and its activity is 17 to 23 days. And after that time, the luteum degenerates. So about 23-29 days, there will be degeneration of luteum, corpus luteum. And this cyclic representation becomes more clear here in this graph. Okay, anyway, keep in mind what are the events taking place in the menstrual cycle. And 1 to 7 days of, that is days of menstruation. Then 8 to 13 days, the uterus shows endometrium proliferation. The ovary shows development of follicles. Okay, then after that, around 14th day, it's the ovulation, release of ovum period, that time. And the ovulatory period, when the ovum is released, the remainings are turning to corpus luteum. Then the phase is luteal activity phase. Then this luteum gradually degenerates. So this is degenerating luteum phase. Then this cycle follows, continues. Okay, just keep this in mind. And if all these things are somewhat clear, we will elaborate it with the help of this graph representation. Okay, in menstrual cycle, we can say there are 4 major phases. Okay, about 1 to 7 days. Anyway, here we mark it 1 to 5 days. This is menstrual phase. It is known as menstrual phase. Okay, the first phase in menstrual cycle we can call as menstrual phase. Okay, then the second phase in menstrual cycle, it's called proliferative phase or follicular phase. It's called follicular phase. Okay, also called proliferative phase. Proliferative phase. We will discuss why the names and all. Okay. Then the third phase is a short phase, ovulatory phase. The short phase is ovulatory phase. Okay. And the fourth phase is the luteal phase. Okay, the fourth phase is luteal phase, also known as secretory phase. Another name is secretory phase. Okay, anyway, we are discussing the menstrual cycle under 4 phases: menstrual phase, follicular phase, ovulatory phase, and the luteal phase. See what happens to this all areas under this different phases. So we are discussing the events taking place at 4 phases. The events taking place in the uterus, in the ovary, and in the hormone levels. In the first case, during menstrual phase. Okay, during menstrual phase, what happens in the uterus? Within the uterus, this is the endometrium shown, the inner lining of uterus. This thing here and it's getting thickened towards that side. Okay, so during menstrual phase, what happens to the uterus endometrium? It is getting broken and released as menstrual bleeding. That is why the name menstrual phase. So during menstrual phase, the inner lining of uterus, the endometrium gets ruptured and it released out. It's released out as bleeding. It is known as menses or menstruation. This is the event in uterus during menstrual phase. Then during menstrual phase, what happened to the ovary? The ovary is with its primary follicles at this period. Okay, the ovary is with the primary follicles which has to develop to the following stages. Okay, then what happened to the hormone levels? And during this time, these hormone levels are normal. Ovarian hormone levels are normal. Then pituitary hormone levels are also normal. Okay, you know the pituitary hormones are the gonadotropins. Okay, LH and FSH. They are collectively called gonadotropins. LH is the luteinizing hormone. You know that. FSH is the follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, then the ovarian hormones, the two hormones are estrogen and progesterone. So, what happened to these hormones in the menstrual phase? These hormones are at normal level during the menstrual phase. Okay, then come to the second phase, follicular phase. What happens at follicular phase? See, during follicular phase, what happens to the uterus is, the uterus, it has already released all endometrium lining. It is starting the replenishment. We can say the follicular phase is also called the proliferative phase because the endometrium starts proliferation. Okay, so gradually the broken endometrium gets proliferated. It is forming again. Okay, it's getting gradually thickened. You can just see follicular phase is getting gradually thickened. Then what happened to the ovary? Here is a major event during follicular. That's why the name follicular phase. During follicular phase, the ovary shows the gradual development of its follicle. Its follicle, primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, and finally form the mature Graafian follicle during follicular phase. So, follicular phase is characterized by the development of follicles. More and more cells, follicular cells, you can see the lining cells, surrounding cells. More and more follicular cells are deposited and it gets matured to secondary, tertiary and Graafian follicles. So, this phase is the follicular phase named as. Okay, and listen carefully, these follicular cells, these surrounding follicular cells are secreting estrogen. So you can see the estrogen gets increased towards the follicular phase. Okay, estrogen is secreted by the follicles. So when the number of follicles increases, what happens? The level of estrogen also increases. Okay, and you can see it gets peak towards the mature Graafian follicle stage. I mean towards the middle of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so the estrogen level is high towards the middle of the menstrual cycle. Estrogen is marked here. So normal levels it is getting increased and is secreted by the follicular cells, and when it is ruptured it gets declined. So that happens to the ovarian hormones. Ovarian hormones, I mean hormone progesterone in normal level, whereas estrogen gets increased. Then what happens to the pituitary hormones? The pituitary hormones LH and FSH gradually rises. Okay, and it gets peak towards the middle of the menstrual cycle. So by the end of the follicular phase is getting gradually increased, the LH and the FSH. Okay, so that's about the follicular phase. The name is based on the ovarian events. follicles gradually mature and the number of follicles increases. So what happened? The follicular cells increases means estrogen level will become high, and towards the middle LH and FSH also become high. And very important thing, next phase is ovulatory phase. Okay, the ovulatory phase is characterized by ovulation. It is exactly at the middle of the menstrual cycle. Here is the rupturing of the Graafian follicle. The mature follicle, this mature follicle ruptures, gets broken, and it releases the ovum, that is called ovulation. So ovulation takes place during the ovulatory phase. So uterus is preceding its proliferation. Okay, within the ovary, the ovulation takes place by the rupturing of Graafian follicle, and estrogen becomes its peak, maximum secretion of estrogen, and that is actually leading to the ovulation. The maximum secretion of LH, FSH and estrogen is actually helping in the ovulation. Okay, so what happens towards the middle cycle? Okay, that means the ovulatory phase, LH is at its peak, it's called LH surge. LH surge. Okay, so the mid cycle there is LH surge. That means LH and FSH is at its peak. Estrogen is also at its peak, and this is helping in the ovulation process. The Graafian follicle ruptures to release the ovum, and that is called ovulation, and uterus is gradually proceeding its proliferation. Okay, so if this ovulation and the released ovum is getting fertilized, okay, it forms the embryo, the zygote and embryo. It has to be accommodated in the uterus. So the uterus is preparing by thickening its endometrium. So it becomes maximum thick towards this phase. Okay, so if this every month the ovum is released, it is expecting a fertilization, and if it's fertilized, this endometrium is supporting it because it's maximum thickened. Okay, fertilized zygote has to come and attach to the endometrium of the uterus. Okay, and if it's not fertilized, the ovum is released out, and by the time after a while, the thickened endometrium also gets ruptured and shed off. Okay, so that's the event. See, understand what happens at the ovulatory phase. I think it's clear. Then come to the fourth phase, luteal phase or secretory phase. Okay, the luteal phase, it is based on, the name is based on the ovary event. That means the remnant of the Graafian follicle, this is released as ovum. This remaining part, the remainings of the Graafian follicle develop to a glandular structure called corpus luteum. So this structure is called corpus luteum, which is formed out of the remaining remnants of the Graafian follicle, and it's a glandular tissue. It's acting as a gland which secretes progesterone. So the progesterone become high during this period when there is maximum action of corpus luteum. Progesterone is high because progesterone is secreted by corpus luteum. So the red color I have given here, the progesterone is high in the luteal phase because luteum secretes progesterone, and this progesterone is very important to support this pregnancy if there is. Okay, so it's maximum thick. The uterus wall is maximum thick to support pregnancy, and progesterone is known as pregnancy supporting hormone. Okay, so it's secreted by luteum, and its aim, it's by its action only the endometrium is maximum thickened. So it is also known as the pregnancy supporting hormone, progesterone. Okay, then keep in mind, by the time LH and FSH come to the normal level, decline. Okay, these are the events during luteal phase. It is called the secretory phase because it's secreting progesterone hormone. Okay, and after that, about 23-24 days when it reaches, the luteum stops its action, is gradually getting disintegrated. It forms corpus albicans, that means the corpus luteum degenerates. The hormone level comes slow down, progesterone. Okay, if the ovum is fertilized and it is there, the zygote formation and the embryo has to attach here. If the embryo attaches to this endometrium, it never shed off. It will be as such thickened. The progesterone will be as such in the body in the increased level to support this. Okay, it never comes to decline. Okay, whereas if there is no chance for fertilization, what happens? This is gradually getting, this endometrium is getting ruptured because progesterone is getting low, decreased, endometrium gets ruptured and be released as menses. Okay, these are the events in menstrual cycle. Once again, I am just revising the major points. Okay, the 4 phases are menstrual phase, then follicular phase, ovulatory phase and luteal phase. Okay, when we discuss the events from 1 to 29 days, the mid-cycle, the 14th day, nearly the 14th day is the ovulation day. Okay, it's for a normal healthy menstrual cycle, the 14th day is exactly the ovulation day. Anyway, the fertility period is taken from about 10 to 17. Approximately, it may go little left and little right. Whatever, the mid-cycle is ovulatory phase. And the menstrual phase is characterized by the menstrual bleeding. Okay, this bleeding is due to the release of ruptured endometrium wall of uterus. This happens only in the absence of pregnancy. That means if the released ovum is not fertilized, if there is no zygote formation and its implantation, its attachment to the uterus, no need of this thickened endometrium. The endometrium thickening is to support pregnancy. If there is no pregnancy, no need of that. So every month it is getting ruptured and released out as bleeding. This is known as menstruation or menses. Okay. Then during this phase, ovary pituitary hormone levels are normal and ovary has no much significant stage and it is just starting its development of ovarian follicles only. Okay, whereas in the second phase, follicular phase, okay, this phase, ovarian hormones and pituitary hormones are almost normal, okay, whereas within the ovary, every small primary follicle is getting increased in size, is getting developed, okay, to secondary, tertiary, Graafian. It is getting developed means it is adding more and more surrounding cells and also the inner changes we have discussed already. Then these follicular cells are adding what? Secreting what? Estrogen. So during this phase, estrogen gets increased because this is secreted by these follicular cells. Okay, whereas progesterone normal, LH normal, FSH normal. Okay, then it's gradually getting LH, FSH gradually getting increased towards the end of the follicular phase. Then during ovulatory phase, the mature Graafian follicle ruptures in the ovary and releases the ovum out. So it's ovulation, characterized by ovulation. Okay, by the time it's gradually, this uterus is gradually thickening, this follicular phase onwards, immediately after its rupture is gradually proliferating. Then estrogen is at the highest secretion, LH and FSH at the peak, LH surge. These are helping in ovulation. Okay, the next phase is the secretory luteal phase. The remaining parts of the Graafian follicle form the corpus luteum. It is secrete progesterone high. So this is supporting the growth of endometrium and maximum growth of endometrium. And if there is a pregnancy, it is ready for its accommodation. Okay, and this LH and FSH decline. Okay, and towards end 23 to 29, that period the corpus luteum activity slows down. It slows down only if there is no fertilization. If there is fertilization, it blocks here because it supports the pregnancy. Then progesterone is always high, endometrium is always thick. And if there is no fertilization, this endometrium, thickened endometrium gets broken as menses. Released as menses. Okay, progesterone decline is helping for that process. This is what about the menstrual cycle. Keep in mind, and it takes place only, it's a healthy cyclic event taking place in a female, which is ensuring the female to become fertile. Okay, and a female is fertile between the menarche and menopause period. Okay, menarche at the age of puberty and menopause at around 50 years of age. Okay, so I think this is almost clear. Thank you.